Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 18. There's been so much going on, I actually had to scrap the first recording of this episode and do it all again to fit in everything that's going on. The title of the episode, Dead Men Walking, is really taken from the reports of Kadyrov's death that may have been greatly exaggerated. But that phrase, it seems, could be applied to many people within Russia's hierarchy, within the top of its business circles, its military and so on, because this week we also saw the extraordinary strike on the Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Crimea. Well, we'll unpack that in more detail. We'll look at stories from the Kiev Independent this week, and we'll also look at the Moscow Times. Some of these stories, of course, will be familiar to you, because they've received extensive coverage in the media, on YouTube and other places. Other stories may have passed you by, and yet they're building up to a picture of extraordinary fragility within Russia, economically, militarily, and we'll have to see whether in the coming months that translates into social and political instability as well. Well, let's start with the Moscow Times from September the 20th, and this is the story about the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. There were widespread rumors not just of his ill health, but of his imminent demise. They mounted through the course of last week, culminating in the Ukrainian media, especially in stories that he was either in a coma or dead. Now, Kadyrov, 46, has ruled the North Caucasus Republic of Chechnya for 15 years, and he's not a nice man. He's earned a reputation for brutality, both within his region and, of course, towards civilians in Ukraine. He has, of course, also been Putin's attack poodle over the last sort of 15 years or so. For business people and others in Russia who get out of line, there is always the threat that Putin may turn Kadyrov and his minions against them. And this threat potentially is enough to keep almost anyone in line. So what are the implications of Kadyrov's death? Could this have significant consequences for the Kremlin and the power it exerts, both in its near abroad, but also at home as well? So how much truth is there to the story that he passed away? Well, a lot of this is based on his appearance and has led to a lot of speculation about his health. His face can appear puffy, often his eyes are squinted, and his speech is frequently slurred. And frankly, a lot of what he says seems to be entirely incoherent. That, however, of course, is not unique amongst world leaders. Also, his weight seems to have dramatically fluctuated between videos, and this has led to a lot of speculation that he may have some serious underlying health issues. Now, the way these rumours circulate is interesting, of course, and one wonders whether they are passed on truthfully or whether they are passed on to create instability. Now, the Ukrainian website Exaggerated said that it had received exclusive commentary from Andrei Yusov, Ukraine's military intelligence spokesman. And this comment suggested that Kadyrov's illnesses had worsened and left him in a serious condition. Well, that then led to an escalating series of articles, and when the Chechen leader didn't appear on camera for a number of days, that led to the wild speculation. This has also had petrol poured on the flames by the former Echo Moskvy editor-in-chief, Alexei Venediktov, who has also written that Kadyrov suffers from kidney failure, but there has been no confirmation of this. There is a rumor as well that Kadyrov had his own doctor tortured and killed because of the suspicion that he had been poisoning the dictator. Now, whether we find out the exact truth of this and the exact sequence of events, it may be many years before we know all the details. What is absolutely clear is that the kind of rumor, speculation will expand to fill the void left by the Kremlin's lies, omissions, and general lack of trust in the information that it can produce. This atmosphere of anecdote replacing news, whispers and rumors replacing truth is symptomatic of an extreme autocratic regime like the one Russia has become. It was also symptomatic during the Soviet period as well, when people would rely more on anecdote to tell them about the reality of the world than they would on the printed media or on television. And let's pick up this theme of dead men walking, because the news has just been announced that the US will reportedly give ATACMS to Ukraine. Will it change the war? Asks the Kiev Independent in an article dated 23rd of September. In addition to this, Zelensky has also confirmed that the first Abrams tanks are already in Ukraine. This also is reported on September the 25th, and it represents a significant uptick in the supply of offensive capability to the Ukrainian military. And these are two systems that people have been agitating, people who support Ukraine and believe that Russia needs to be defeated decisively, have been agitating for these military systems to be delivered now for many, many months. And there has been speculation that the failure to provide these kind of capabilities is one of the reasons why the offensive conducted by Ukraine has been seen to be moving quite slowly. Another key piece of equipment, F-16s, are on their way, but not yet sighted in the theatre of operations. And considering the progress of the counteroffensive, which has become a point of significant disagreement and tension between military analysts, the media, and amongst some allies. And of course, these differences of interpretation of the success of the Ukrainian offensive is being weaponized very effectively by the Russians to seek to try and discourage support for Ukraine, to seek to divide those countries that are providing support to Ukraine from each other. But this is where Russia may be out of luck. In another story from September the 23rd from the Kiev Independent, it's commented on that Ukraine has achieved a military breakthrough in Verbove. Ukraine's forces on the southern Zaporizhia front have breached Russia's lines in Verbove, the General Alexander Tarnavsky, the commander of Ukraine's military fighting in Donetsk and Zaporizhia Oblast, announced. He gave an interview with CNN where he went into a lot of details. Now, Verbove is located around 20 kilometers southeast of Robotyne, which was liberated on August the 28th, and is well on the path towards the strategic hub of Tokamak. Now, taking Tokamak is not only strategic in military terms, it would also be a substantial victory in terms of morale for the Ukrainian forces. It would be far more difficult for Putin and his propagandists to play down the success of Ukraine's offensive if it was seen to be taking such significant targets. Now, Tokmak, as has been stated, is the minimal goal of the counteroffensive, and with both the US election coming up next year and winter soon to be descending in this part of the world, it's absolutely critical that Ukraine is seen to be making success and progress towards the eventual goal of liberating the south and going on towards Crimea. Now, the ultimate goal of the counteroffensive remains the breaking of Russia's land bridge to occupy Crimea and the long-term liberation of all territories currently occupied by Russian forces. Ukraine has been clear about that goal, hasn't deviated from that goal, and even though its allies have not fully confirmed that they are absolutely aligned with these maximalist aims, it's highly likely that Putin will continue to throw troops and materials into the war up until the point he is decisively beaten and discontent with his poor strategic decisions reaches a culmination point. Now, there are two interesting points to pull out of this article. Tarnavsky has said that fighting has been varied and intense, and Ukrainian forces have been hampered by the so-called Surovikin line, built under the command of General Sergei Surovikin. And this is a layered defense that includes significant minefields, but also groups of well-placed defensive Russian soldiers. It is thought that Ukraine has now punched through the last of these lines, and this potentially opens up the possibility of further and far more rapid gains towards the south. The other interesting point is that it has been widely expected, especially by military analysts who may not be embedded with Ukrainian troops and may not be as close to decisions and conditions on the ground. Many are expecting that once the weather becomes cold, once we get into the rainy season, that Ukraine's offensive operations will significantly slow down. Now, this happened last year, but that may have been more to do with the fact they didn't have the required material and trained personnel to push on further and were unwilling to take huge casualties without the correct equipment. This year, they may well have the correct equipment, And Tarnowski has said that he does not actually expect the coming rainy season and ensuing winter to heavily influence the counteroffensive. Well, let's now turn to this attack on Russia's Black Sea Fleet headquarters by the Ukrainian military. And this story is from September the 22nd. Now, many of you will, of course, have seen the extraordinary images of the Storm Shadow missiles taking out the main building. The Russian Ministry of Defense reported that the Ukrainian missile strike on Sevastopol in Russia-occupied Crimea damaged the building of Russia's Black Sea Fleet headquarters. That, it seems, is a significant understatement. The building is an absolute wreck. That is obvious from the pictures themselves. It is also reported that around 24 senior military commanders were taken out in that strike. There are also rumors, unconfirmed, that Ukraine may have been tipped off about this unusual gathering of so many senior strategic decision makers. Now, whether this is a mole within the Russian military, whether this is sabotage groups who were reporting observations from the ground, we don't know. But it does seem that the operation by Ukraine in the previous week to pick apart Russia's best air defense systems in Crimea may have cleared the way for this subsequent attack on the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. And whereas the military significance, of course, I think is fairly obvious. The impact on Russian morale will be huge. The anger felt by Z bloggers will be immense. And the propagandists, no doubt, will feel a certain amount of anger, but also apprehension that Ukraine is now able to strike such high-value targets. It's also worth noting that civilian infrastructure was not damaged, and there was not a single casualty amongst civilians reported. This was a precision strike using precision munitions, and it really highlights the point. With the right equipment, with the right willpower, you can strike with minimal impact on civilian infrastructure and civilians themselves. But that really shines a light on Russia's attacks, which almost universally hit civilian infrastructure and have a huge impact on the lives of people, both in the area, the town or village that's hit. And this really puts into sharp focus the Russian attacks. Now, their missiles may not be quite as precise, but it does suggest that Russians are deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure, because that degree of inaccuracy is hardly plausible. Here we have Ukraine hitting a significant target with no collateral damage outside of it. In Russian attacks, they are almost exclusively on civilian infrastructure and have a huge toll on civilians as well. And in Russia's apparent reaction to this attack on the Black Sea Fleet, last night they attacked one of the largest hotel buildings in Odessa, almost entirely destroying the building. Fortunately, there seem to be relatively few people actually resident in the building, and it's reported the number of deaths and casualties is relatively low, especially if you consider the scale of the damage that Russia inflicted on the building and the surrounding area. Well, in the second half of this episode, we're going to turn to Russia itself and again continue the theme of dead men walking. In an article from the Moscow Times on the 18th of September, Holly Jones examines the cult of the Red Terror executioner. And this story is about the unveiling of a dark bronze statue, a monument to the Bolshevik secret police chief Felix Dzerzhinsky. Now, this statue used to appear outside the notorious KGB headquarters of the Lubyanka in the center of Moscow. And in the 90s, heralded by a cheering crowd on August the 22nd, 1991, the 12-foot, 11-ton statue of Dzerzhinsky was lifted by crane onto a flatbed and taken away from Moscow. That seemed to herald a new and more open future in Russia, a future that was to be less characterized by terror, intimidation, torture, prison camps, and so on. Fast forward more than 30 years, and this statue is being reinstated outside the office of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service headquarters. And in this photo, which we will post, you can see an extraordinary range of somber, miserable, suited ghouls standing in front of the statue. And this is truly a terrifying moment. And for anyone in Russia that has even an ounce of historic memory, who has any understanding of how the 1930s impacted every family. The return of this statue, the return of the iconography of the KGB into the mainstream of political life must be a terrifying thought. At the same time as Russia is tightening its centralized control and bringing back the icons of terror, it seems to be losing its grip in the near abroad. This article from the 21st of September from the Moscow Times also looks at Nagorno-Karabakh and examines the idea that Russia has no credibility at all as a regional peacekeeper. And this is because violence has once again returned to Nagorno-Karabakh. On Tuesday of the previous week, Azerbaijan launched what it called an anti-terrorism exercise in the breakaway territory. And in one bold move, it swept away the separatist authorities and the resistance they had put up for the last 30 years. That puppet authority, of course, was strongly supported by Armenia, and Armenia, in its turn, supported by Russia and its so-called peacekeepers. And it is symptomatic of a weakening military center that Russia can no longer exert influence in these regions, that its so-called peacekeepers are no longer feared. And this could be a sign of more changes to come, more instability as Russia's control and coercion over its near abroad starts to weaken and crumble. But as its military clout diminishes, is there any sign that the political and administrative power of Moscow is weakening? Now, this is a fascinating article from September the 23rd, again in the Moscow Times, written by Leyla Latypova. And it talks about Russian officials who are fighting in Ukraine and seeking a boost to their profiles, boost to their careers. The article explains scores of Russian officials signed up to fight in the Ukraine war since Moscow launched the full-scale invasion. And of course, these officials will harbor a great range of motivations for going into military service. Some may believe that it advances their career in an increasingly militarized political landscape. Others hope that it may save them from dismissal from their jobs or even the risk of a lengthy jail sentence if they have ever expressed any negative sentiment towards the war or the army. But what's interesting is that most high-ranking officials seem to be on the front line of Ukraine. They've joined up through a single volunteer battalion. That is the Kasgad, headed by State Duma Deputy Dmitry Sablin. The battalion was allegedly formed in the wake of Russia's partial military mobilization last year. Its members are believed to have been deployed in the Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine, so not necessarily on the real hotspots of the eastern front line or the southern front line. Now, although these officials enlisted in Kasgad frequently and very vocally post on social media about their life as soldiers, some of them have even received military decorations, experts are quite skeptical as to the true extent of their actual involvement in the war. And that is not least because some of them continue to perform their legislative duties in parallel while still being deployed, apparently, at the front. It's difficult to say whether any of them are actually participating in combat alone or whether this is a bit of a personal PR and political stunt. Now, this is a fascinating article. I recommend you read the details. There's quite a lot of examples of individual deputies and politicians there, and it really does build up a picture that they are not fighting and suffering in the trenches like ordinary Russian soldiery, and this perhaps should not come as a surprise. And another example of dead men walking is from the excellent article dated the 22nd of September by Jade McGlynn. You'll know Jade from the channel. She's appeared twice and is an incredibly fascinating expert on Russia's descent into militarism. She writes, Russia is preparing the next generation to die for their country. This is a long article. Again, I recommend you read it end to end, but it paints a disturbing picture of the state molding and training youth to be ready not just to serve their country, not just to fulfill their patriotic duty, not just to be prepared to die for their country's so-called spiritual and moral values. It's preparing the Russian youth for the idea that they will likely die in the coming years, if not in this war, then in a bigger war to come. Putin's vision has been formalized in the new philosophy of formation, as it's called, and that has been developed by the Russian Children's Center in conjunction with Znania, or Knowledge, a Soviet-era organization that was relaunched in 2015 to provide state-approved educational guidance and resources to the public. This new philosophy, writes Jade McGlynn, aims to unify approaches to moral and academic education, incorporating schools, families, and community organizations into the process. It focuses on improving children and young people's capabilities and instilling approved spiritual and moral values. Now, this isn't just scouts on steroids. This seems to be a full-scale military indoctrination and an actual manifestation of the cult of death being introduced to children at a young age and throughout every aspect of their education, every stage of their education and formation as young adults. It's truly disturbing, but what is it preparing them for? Well, this article from the Moscow Times of the 21st of September suggests what awaits them. Mobilized Russian troops endure quick losses in Ukraine. And this is a fascinating report which looks at the survival rate and experiences of recent Russian troops drafted into the military to fight in Ukraine and which died as a result of that. And this is a horrific statistic they start the article with. 1 in 5 mobilized Russian soldiers who died in the Ukraine war were killed less than 2 months after being enlisted. Now, this statistic has been produced by the independent investigative outlet iStories and the War Monitoring Project Conflict Intelligence Team, but it does cite publicly available data. This data source apparently is based on 3,000 draftees who've died since President Vladimir Putin announced the partial mobilization last September. Out of these 3,000, only 4 of those reservists who died in the conflict lasted more than 11 months before being killed. That is a horrific statistic. From being on the streets, living a civilian life, to being drafted on the front and coming back in a box is less than 2 months. And it makes us wonder how many of the 300,000 apparently mobilized reservists that were sent into the army from the 21st of September 2022, one has to wonder how many of those remain now. It could well be a very small percentage. And that is why rumors continue to circle of a massive, imminent new drafting of Russians to fight and, of course, potentially die on the front. Now, we will be doing a separate episode about that, the risks of mobilization, the scale of mobilization, and what is known about Russia's next wave of massive mobilization of its human meat wave army. So how is this likely to play out over the coming months? Well, one story here, a short story in the Kiev Independent, suggests that the attacks on energy infrastructure have started up once again. Of course, we expect in the coming weeks, the coming month, the weather to get much colder in Ukraine as we head into the second winter of war. And it's widely expected that Russia will once again order massive strikes on energy infrastructure as a way to grind down the morale of Ukrainians. Well, that didn't work last year. It's unlikely to work this year, especially as the air defenses are likely in many cities to be much tighter than they were at the same time last year. But what awaits Russia? Well, this is a fascinating story, and we will be examining it in more detail. The Russian energy or fuel crisis. We'll have a special episode on the economy and the fuel crisis later this week. But a fascinating story in the Moscow Times suggests that Russia has curbed gas and diesel exports in order to stabilize fuel prices. Because the last thing Putin wants is rampant fuel inflation in a country that is such a huge producer of hydrocarbons. Not only would that send out a very worrying and concerning signal to Russian people, it would also cause a significant spike in costs for people who work in essential industries like agriculture, growing food to feed the cities. And we've already seen a number of protests earlier this month as fuel started to run short in some key agricultural districts There was even a risk of farmers protesting, which didn't happen in the end, but Putin will be keen to avoid such public shows of discontent. But why are those problems unlikely to go away? We're going to end on a story from the Kiev Independent, dated September the 22nd, and this really is from a piece of reporting by Bloomberg, which suggests that Russia is planning massive hikes in defense spending in 2024. Next year, Russia's defense spending will be increased to 6% of the country's gross domestic product. That is up from 3.9% this year and 2.7% in 2021. Based on the draft budget plans that have been seen by Bloomberg, there is secret expenditure of classified or unspecified items that the Kremlin, of course, hopes to keep from the public to avoid the scrutiny of the war's impact. But defense spending is expected to double. So even though the headline figure is 6% of the country's gross domestic product, it may well be that there is hidden expenditure that may well inflate that number significantly higher. Russia also expects a rise in oil and gas revenue, which will make up a considerable chunk of the country's income. And that, of course, is a gamble. Because if oil and gas prices do not rise, because if those who are buying Russian hydrocarbons demand a better deal, or if that demand drops off, Russia will be in significant financial trouble. It's shocking also in this article to read that countries like Spain and Belgium import a record volume of liquefied natural gas from Russia over the last 12 months, and that is helping to fill Moscow's coffers. Now, this is something the West can do. If we can plug some of the gaps here by further reducing dependence on Russian hydrocarbons and their products, then that could put further pressure on the Russian economy. Now, why is the story especially important? And that's because Russia is not just investing a vast amount of money in its military in order to defend itself against the outside world. That has likely never been a realistic threat. Putin almost certainly never believed that NATO would invade Russian territory. So what is this massive defense spending for? Well, this is the worrying aspect of it. It indicates that Putin is digging in for a long war. He thinks he can outlast the West, that his willpower, his determination to triumph, and his maximalist goals to take the whole of Ukraine have not gone away. Putin is prepared to burn up the wealth of Russia, both its material and human resources, to achieve his absurd objectives. And there is no sign of him diminishing those objectives, changing his mind, or being prepared to negotiate in any way to end his aggressive war against Ukraine. And we will delve briefly into the antics of Clown World. Russian state TV can't get over Zelensky's recent trip, and the propagandists continue to resort to genocidal, dehumanizing rhetoric, points out Julia Davis in her excellent project, Russian Media Monitor. Now, there have been rumors circulating that Tucker Carlson will be having his own show on Russia 24 on Russian television. But Julia Davis points out this is likely trolling on the part of Russia, but it must be noted that his segments are continuously translated and rebroadcast on Russian television, and he seems not to have denounced that practice in any way. If anything, he encourages it by still coming out with phrases and opinions that are extremely attractive to Russian propaganda networks. And how have the propagandists reacted to the attacks on the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol? I'm not aware that Solovyov has yet commented on these, but here is a characteristic example of the propagandist art from Julia Vitiazeva. And she says that she is at peace after learning of Ukraine's strikes on Sebastopol, knowing that Kiev, Odessa, and other Ukrainian cities will lay in ruins. Following that, she then solicits donations to buy thermal underwear for the Russian soldiers. Sergei Mardan, one of the most toxic of the TV propagandists, explained without any detail of why this is true, that Russia cannot be defeated. We control half the world and everything is cool, he says, thus giving away the imperialist nature of Russia's aggression. And finally, let's look at two extraordinary recruitment adverts that are playing on Russian TV. One of them has a simple message: join the Russian invasion of Ukraine and avoid the violence from debt collectors. This is a grim, cynical, and terrifying advert. It shows a man living besieged within his department where debt collectors have scrawled slogans on his door. Here lives a debtor. He decides to leave the apartment and is confronted by two thugs who claim they're going to break his arms if he doesn't pay up. He then shows them a slip of paper proving that he's joined the Russian army. Joining the Russian army gives you sanctuary from your creditors, says the advert. Joining the army to avoid your debts is a man's decision, claims the advert. We'll put a link in this video. It's truly terrifying. And the final one is extraordinary. It makes absolutely clear in the recruitment advert that the invasion of Ukraine is an old-fashioned war of colonial conquest. It features Russian soldiers discussing where they plan to live in conquered Ukraine. One dreams of owning an apartment in the most prestigious area of Kiev. The other wants to retire to the Black Sea, wants to retire to the south in Odessa and live in luxury near the beach there. The two soldiers are running through a trench system, taking pot shots at the enemy as they talk. I don't know whether those who created the advert wanted to make it reminiscent of the First World War, but if you squint and you turn your screen to black and white, then you could potentially be in the trenches of the Somme or Verdun. This is the world that Russia has created. This is the world that the Russian propagandists promote in their videos. And this is the Russian world that Putin wants to bring to Europe if we let him, and if Ukraine wasn't there to halt them in their tracks.